Liberty process.
This is an instructional disassembly video for the Millennium Series 1E012G1L progressing cavity pump. Before starting the disassembly of your Liberty Process pump, we recommend that you contact a Liberty Process representative if you have any questions. If the pump has been in service, we recommend you have flushed and drained the pump of all pump mediums and have a sturdy workbench on which to work. Tools required for the disassembly of the Millennium Series 1E012G1L progressing cavity pump: a 5/32, 3/16 inch, and 5/16 inch Allen wrench, a 7/16, ½ inch, 9/16, 3/4, 7/8, and 15/16 inch wrench, a 5/32 inch ball driver for the clamp ring on the shell, an adjustable hook spanner wrench and pin punch, a rubber mallet, hammer, and dowel rod, a tape measure and a level, a small flat-bladed screwdriver, a container for grease salvage and disposable rags for grease removal, a vise mounted to a table or stand, and an arbor press or hydraulic press. Split packing gland removal. Remove the two packing gland nuts and washers from the studs in the bearing housing using a 9/16 inch wrench. Slide the split packing gland off the bolts and remove from the bearing housing. If needed, you can remove the packing gland studs by unthreading them from the bearing housing. Stator removal. Remove the adapter by removing the 4 discharge connection bolts using a 15/16 inch wrench. Remove the gasket from the discharge adapter. Next, remove the 4 bolts connecting the stator to the suction casing using a 15/16 inch wrench. Remove the 2 stator support bolts using a 15/16 inch wrench and remove the top of the stator. Using a strap wrench or a chain wrench, rotate the stator to unscrew it from the rotor. If necessary, have someone hold the head of the drive shaft to keep it from rotating. Once the stator is removed, stand it vertically on the workbench. Remove the gasket from the suction casing. Remove the retaining ring using a small flat-bladed screwdriver. Flip the stator over and remove the retaining ring from the other side. Next, remove the clamp rings. If necessary, use a rubber mallet to assist in removing the clamp rings. Drive shaft removal. Using a hammer and a pin punch, remove the key from the keyway in the drive shaft. Remove the 6 shaft head socket screws using a 5/16 inch Allen wrench and remove the shaft head. Although not shown here, you're going to want to clean away grease from the inside of the shaft head and from the entire gear assembly. The grease can be discarded, or if salvageable, can be stored for reuse. Remove the primary thrust plate from the shaft head. Next, remove the 2 keys in the gear rack from inside the drive shaft. Remove the nylon lock nut using a 7/8 inch socket wrench while keeping one hand on the rotor to keep it from turning. Remove the ball gear, then the secondary thrust plate, then the spacer, and finally the rubber seal. Rotor and connecting rod removal and disassembly. Remove the rotor and connecting rod by pulling it out through the opening in the suction casing. Stand the assembly on a workbench, rotor side down. Use a 5/32" ball driver to remove the two-piece clamp ring. Remove the O-ring from the bottom of the shell and place it at the base of the rotor. Remove the set screw in the shell using a 5/32" Allen wrench. Remove the shell from the assembly by lifting it up and off the connecting rod. Although not shown here, remove all excess grease. Remove the connecting rod from the stator and place it on the workbench. Remove the gear rack and keys from the rotor head, followed by the primary thrust plate. Now place the connecting rod in a vise. Remove the nylon nut from the connecting rod with a 7/8" socket wrench. Next, remove the gear ball, followed by the thrust plate, gear ball spacer, and finally the gear ball seal. The connecting rod and rotor assembly is now completely disassembled. Suction casing and stuffing box removal. Remove the 4 bolts connecting the suction casing to the bearing housing using a 15/16" wrench. With the help of another person if needed, slide the suction casing off the shaft in the bearing housing. Set the suction casing on a workbench with the stuffing box facing up. Using a packing puller if needed, remove all layers of packing until you reach the lantern ring. Remove the lantern ring, followed by the remaining layers of packing. Remove the retaining ring using a small flat-bladed screwdriver. You can now remove the clamp ring. Thrust grease seal and bearing cover removal. Remove the drive shaft seal plug using a 3/16" Allen wrench. Remove the 6 retaining bolts and lock washers from the bearing cover using a 9/16" wrench. Place the bearing cover on a workbench and remove the O-ring. If you'd like to remove the seal from the bearing cover, put it in a vise and gently tap the seal out with a flat-bladed screwdriver and hammer. Be advised, removing the seal will damage it, causing it to be unusable. Drive shaft and bearing removal and disassembly. Before pressing out the drive shaft, remove the flinger ring as well as the brass set screw from the drive shaft lock nut using a 5/32" Allen wrench. Unclamp the housing from the workbench and place the bearing housing into a press in such a way that the drive shaft can be pressed all of the way out. Place the bearing housing on a workbench with the bearing plate side facing up. Use a hammer and dowel to push the radial seal out of the bearing housing. Once again, be advised that removing the seal will damage it and cause it to be unusable. Place the drive shaft on a workbench vertically with the lock nut facing up. Using an adjustable hook spanner wrench, turn the lock nut counterclockwise and completely remove the lock nut from the drive shaft. Keeping pressure on the inner race of the bearings to prevent damage, place the drive shaft in a vise and press the drive shaft out of the bearings. Although not shown here, place the bearings and spacer on a workbench and remove the grease from the drive shaft and bearings. If salvageable, the grease can be stored for reuse. Your Millennium Series 1E012G1L progressing cavity pump is now completely disassembled. If you have any questions about or require spare parts for the repair of your Liberty Process 1E012G1L progressive cavity pump, please feel free to contact us at www.libertyprocess.com. We always have complete pumps and all spare parts in our inventory ready to ship the same day.